Imagine this. A school, maybe centuries old, suddenly, its future is up in the air.
Or even a local clinic, something vital, suddenly struggling to stay open.
Exactly. And it's not fiction. It's happening, or at least it's a real worry for lots of institutions across India right now.
All because the legal ground underneath them, the Waqf law, is shifting.
Right. And recent events have really turned up the volume on that uncertainty.
It's a fundamental reevaluation, really.
So today we're diving deep into this. We're looking at the Waqf Amendment Act of 2025 and, crucially, the Supreme Court's intervention just yesterday, April 17th.
A really significant moment touching on, well, community life, religious practice.
Definitely. Now, maybe just quickly for everyone listening, what exactly is a waqf?
Sure. Think of it like a special kind of trust under Islamic law.
Okay.
Land or property is basically set aside permanently for a specific purpose, usually religious, charitable, or for community welfare.
So things like mosques, schools, maybe helping people in need.
Exactly. And the Waqf Act of 1995, that's been the main rule book for managing these properties.
Managed by state waqf boards and a central waqf council, right?
Precisely. It's about this perpetual endowment meant to benefit the community long term.
Got it. Which is why this new amendment and the Supreme Court stepping in is such a big deal.
It's generating a lot of discussion.
So our aim today is to cut through some of the, let's say, legal jargon. We want to really understand what these changes are about.
And why they're causing such a stir, yeah.
And then figure out what this pause from the Supreme Court actually means for these community assets. We got some great questions about this, so we're here to unpack it, focusing on the core issues and the potential impact.
Trying to get beyond the headlines to the real world stuff.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What actually led to this new amendment, the 2025 Act?
Well, the Waqf Amendment Act 2025, it went through Parliament, got signed into law on April 5th this year. The stated goals were to tighten up regulations, boost transparency, and deal with what the government described as misuse of Waqf properties.
Right, on the surface, better rules, more openness. Who argues with that?
Exactly. Seems reasonable. But, as often happens, the devil's in the details. And the reaction wasn't exactly welcoming.
No.
Not at all. It triggered, well, quite a backlash almost immediately. Over 70 petitions landed in the Supreme Court.
Wow, 70. That's significant.
It is. And these weren't just random objections. They came from MPs, religious scholars, activists.
All arguing what, fundamentally?
That the amendments go too far.
Yeah.
That they infringe on fundamental rights and unfairly target the Muslim community.
Okay, so that strong opposition sets the stage for the Supreme Court getting involved yesterday. What did the court actually do?
Right. So April 17th, a bench with Chief Justice Sanjiv Khanna, Justice Sanjay Kumar, and Justice K.V. Viswanathan looked at it.
And their decision?
Their core decision was to put a temporary halt, a stay, on some of the really controversial parts of the new act.
Ah, okay. Not the whole thing, but specific bits.
Exactly. Until the next hearing, which is set for May 5th. So during this period, no changes can happen to Waqf properties or the boards based on these specific amended rules.
So a pause button, essentially, to stop things getting implemented right away.
Pretty much. Gives everyone some breathing room, as you said.
Did the government offer any assurances during this hearing?
Yes, that was quite key. The Solicitor General Tushar Mehta represented the center. He assured the court that no action would be taken on properties that were already recognized as Waqf by user or Waqf by deed under the old 1995 Act.
Okay, Waqf by user. Unpack that for us a bit. What does that mean?
It's really important. It basically means properties used for religious or charitable purposes for a very long time, decades or even centuries, gain recognition as Waqfs, even if there isn't a formal deed saying so.
So, based on historical use and tradition, a mosque that's just been there.
Exactly. Continuous community use is recognized. So the assurance is that those properties, recognized under the old system, won't be immediately affected by this freeze.
That sounds crucial. Anything else?
Yes, the court was also told there'd be a halt on any new appointments to the Central Waqf Council and the state boards under the rules of this new 2025 Act. Again, just for this interim period.
It really sounds like the court wanted to prevent any irreversible changes while they figure things out. Was there a specific quote or statement from the judges that stood out?
Yes, Chief Justice Khanna was very clear. He said, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, if a property was registered as Waqf under the 1995 Act, it stays that way until we sort this out.
Pretty direct, maintaining the status quo for now.
Exactly.
And the timeline. What happens between now and May 5th?
The court set deadlines. The center, the states, and the Waqf boards have 7 days to file their responses to all these petitions.
Okay.
Then the petitioners get 5 days to reply to those responses.
So a lot of legal paperwork flying back and forth?
Absolutely. And then the hearing on May 5th, where we expect a deeper dive into the arguments.
Right. Let's get into those arguments now. What are the main things in this amendment that have caused such strong opposition, the core controversies?
Okay, there are several, but 3 big ones really stand out. First, the composition of the Waqf boards and the Central Council.
How so?
The new law changes the makeup. It limits the number of Muslim members, like 8 out of 22 on the Central Council, 4 out of 11 on state boards. And crucially, it allows for non-Muslims to be nominated or appointed.
Ah, and this is where Chief Justice Khanna asked that very pointed question, isn't it?
Exactly. He asked the Solicitor General quite directly something like, would you let Muslims sit on Hindu endowment boards? Say it openly.
Wow, that really cuts to the chase.
It does. It highlights this principle, should religious bodies be run by people from that faith? It raises fundamental questions about representation.
So it's less about the specific numbers, maybe, and more about that underlying principle of who governs religious affairs.
I think that's a big part of the objection, yes. It's about self-governance for religious institutions.
Okay, what's the second major point of contention?
The second big one is scrapping the idea of whack by user.
The one we just talked about, recognition through long-term use?
Exactly. The amendment wants to get rid of that as a basis for recognizing whack property. You'd need more formal documentation, essentially.
And the worry is?
The worry is huge. Yeah. Critics say this could lead to potentially thousands of historically used religious properties losing their whack status. Denotification, they call it.
So places that have functioned as community centers or mosques for generations could suddenly not be whack anymore.
That's the fear. One newspaper report mentioned it could potentially erase long-standing religious properties. It prioritizes formal paperwork over potentially centuries of lived practice.
You can see how that would cause massive upheaval and uncertainty for communities.
Absolutely. Imagine the impact on the ground.
Okay, that's huge. What's the third main controversy?
The third one revolves around district collectors. The amendment gives them new powers to decide disputes over Waqf property.
Including ownership disputes.
Yes, deciding ownership and other disputes.
And what's the objection there?
Well, senior lawyers, like Kapil Sibal, argued this basically makes the collector a judge in their own cause.
How so?
Especially if the government itself is one of the parties claiming the land. The concerns about impartiality. Is a government revenue official the right person to be deciding these potentially complex and sensitive religious property matters?
Right, a question of bias in appropriate jurisdiction. Were there other constitutional arguments being made beyond these 3?
Oh, yes. Petitioners argue the act potentially violates several fundamental rights.
Well,
Article 14, equality before the law. Article 15, non-discrimination based on religion. Article 25, freedom of religion. And Article 26, the right for religious denominations to manage their own affairs.
so a broad constitutional challenge.
Very much so. You had political figures like Asaduddin Owaisi calling it unconstitutional. The challenges are framed in terms of fundamental rights being infringed.
Okay, a wide range of serious concerns. How has the government responded? What's their defense?
The Solicitor General argued that this wasn't rushed. He called it a considered piece of legislation, resulting from lots of public input.
Input about what, specifically?
He mentioned needing to address situations where apparently entire villages were being claimed as Waqf property, suggesting some Waqf boards might have been overreaching.
So, curbing perceived excesses.
That seems to be the government's line. He also stressed they are answerable to the people.
And how did the court react to that defense? Were they convinced?
The court seemed cautious. They pushed back a bit on the idea that pausing parts of the act would be too harsh. Chief Justice Khanna was clear they weren't stopping the whole act, just preventing irreversible changes for now. And on that point about non-Muslim appointments, the Chief Justice's question about Hindu boards really put the government on the back foot. Mr. Mehta's response seemed to shift a little after that direct question.
Interesting. It sounds like the court is really scrutinizing the justifications. Were there other arguments from the petitioners we haven't touched on?
Yes. One more significant point was about Islamic inheritance laws, specifically something called Waqf al-Aulad.
What's that?
These are basically family waqfs, trusts, set up primarily for the benefit of the founder's family and descendants.
Okay, so more private arrangements.
In a sense, but still under Waqf law. The petitioners argued that even though the amendment seems to protect heirs' rights, including women's rights, which is often cited positively, it might actually interfere with these established family trust practices, which they argue are protected religious practices under Article 26.
So unintended consequences for family trusts
That's the argument, that it disrupts protected religious customs.
and the court's view on that.
Well, the court did make a counterpoint. They noted that Parliament does have the power to legislate on inheritance matters, even those linked to religion. They mentioned the Hindu Succession Act as an example where Parliament stepped in.
So drawing a line between administration and core religious practice again?
It seems that way, a very fine line they're navigating.
It's incredibly complex. With, as you said, over 70 petitions, how is the court actually managing all of this procedurally?
Yeah, that's a practical challenge. They decided to focus on 5 main lead petitions to make it manageable.
Okay.
And they appointed a lawyer, Kanu Agarwal, as the main contact person for the government side, the nodal council, to coordinate responses.
Streamlining things.
Exactly. And they even changed the case title, apparently at the suggestion of the Solicitor General, to just Waqf Amendment Act, to group everything together.
Makes sense. Stepping back a bit, what's the bigger picture here? Why should someone not directly involved care about this?
Oh, it goes way beyond just land titles.
Yeah.
It really touches on fundamental issues of trust, religious identity, the balance between state governance and religious freedom in a country as diverse as India.
Right.
We're talking potentially millions of acres of land tied up in Waqf. These properties support schools, hospitals, mosques, vital community infrastructure.
So the stakes are incredibly high for many people.
Absolutely. And you have the government's stated aim of tackling mismanagement, which some acknowledge exists, but the way it's being done raises these deep questions. The court's cautious approach shows they recognize how sensitive this is.
And didn't the Chief Justice also mention something about positive aspects?
Yes, he made an interesting observation, something like, there are some good aspects too, which neither side is mentioning,
Yeah.
suggesting perhaps a more nuanced reality than the polarized arguments might suggest.
Interesting. Could you give us just a little historical context? How did we get here with Waqf law?
Sure, briefly. The 1995 acts we keep mentioning, that wasn't the first. It replaced older laws from 1923 and 1954, aiming to standardize things across India.
And it gave Waqf boards significant powers.
Yes, including the power to reclaim encroached land, sometimes controversially, without usual time limits. Then there were amendments in 2013 that also stirred debate.
So it's been an evolving, sometimes contentious area of law for a while.
Definitely. The 2025 Act, passed in early April after heated debates, introduced these big changes: mandatory registration, stricter definitions, non-Muslim appointments, all under the banner of transparency and accountability from the government side.
But triggering this immediate backlash we've been discussing.
Precisely.
And it's crucial, I think, to bring it back to the human level. How does all this legal back and forth impact ordinary people?
Immensely. You could have farmers tangled in land disputes with Waqf boards for years.
Right.
Or communities completely dependent on a school or clinic funded by Waqf income. For them, this legal uncertainty is incredibly stressful. It affects their livelihoods, their access to services, their sense of community stability.
So the Supreme Court's temporary freeze, while legally complex, must provide some immediate relief or at least breathing space on the ground.
You'd hope so. It pauses potentially disruptive actions, giving time for clarity. But the underlying uncertainty remains until the court makes a more definitive ruling.
Okay, so looking ahead to May 5th, what are the possible outcomes we might anticipate from that hearing?
Well, after reviewing all the responses and replies, the court could decide to formally stay or pause specific controversial sections of the Act for a longer period while the case proceeds.
Like the non-Muslim appointments or the collector's powers?
Potentially, yes. Or they might find the government's arguments more persuasive and allow parts of the Act to go ahead, perhaps with some clarifications or safeguards.
It feels like the court is very aware of the public attention on this.
Undoubtedly. Chief Justice Khanna even had to condemn some reported violence linked to the Act in an earlier hearing, showing they understand the real-world tensions.
So a lot riding on that May 5th hearing.
A huge amount.
It really is a complex situation, isn't it? At the intersection of law, faith, property, and governance.
Absolutely. The core takeaway, I think, is that this Waqf Amendment Act isn't just a legal tweak. It raises profound questions about religious freedom, property rights, and how India balances secular governance with the autonomy of its diverse religious communities.
And the Supreme Court stepping in really throws those deep divisions and constitutional questions into sharp relief.
Exactly.
And for everyone listening, this case really highlights how legal changes can directly affect communities on the ground. It's about that constant balancing act between religious autonomy and government oversight.
It's a live example of how legal debates have very real, tangible consequences.
Definitely. So as we wait for the Supreme Court's next steps around May 5th, maybe a final thought to leave with is, how does a society reconcile these historical religious trusts, sometimes centuries old, with modern legal ideas and frameworks?
What principles should guide that? It's a tough question, and this case provides a really compelling, current example of that challenge in a diverse nation like India. It's about the evolving relationship between law, religion, and community.
A really important discussion. Thanks for breaking that down. For this deep dive, we looked at reports from various sources like The Hindu, Times of India, Live Law, News 18, Rising Kashmir, and the Indian Express from yesterday, April 17th. We definitely encourage listeners to explore those if they want more detail.